Thanks. Yeah, I'm Ryan Cristiani. I work at HackerU. How many people here have heard of ES6 before? How many people are using it today? How many people would like to start using it today? Great. Cool. So we're going to talk about ES6 Easy Wins. So I'm Ryan. I work at HackerU as an instructor developer. Cristiani on Twitter. That's my username. And I'm a mentor at Node School. And I'll loop that back around when we talk about ES6 a little bit later, because Node's pretty good with ES6 these days. When I say easy wins, as a teacher, this new stuff is constantly evolving. And when we're teaching students, we have to start thinking about how can we start teaching them the new syntax, the new sort of spec now. And these are the things that I consider to be sort of easy to grasp without having to do too much digging. We're not going to talk about generators or anything like that, because I don't think I've still read an article that explains generators very well. So what we're going to talk about is a couple of things. So today we're going to talk about let and const, template strings, arrow functions, spread operator, REST parameters, modules, destructuring, the class keyword, and promises. And then finally at the end, I'll show you how you can actually start using it today, because that's really what we want to start doing, right? We don't want to have to wait too long for all this stuff to get into the browser before we can start using it. So a little history. First things first, time was created. It's a great time to be alive. Then 1995, JavaScript started to take shape. It's a really popular story by now. Everybody knows it. I'm not even going to try to butcher it. It took 10 days. Pretty famous. In about 1999, we got ES3. It was starting to be released, and work began on what would be ES4. However, in 2005, we also had Y2K there. In about 2005, work on ES4 was abandoned. There was kind of two camps about it. Big companies wanted, specific things in. Other companies were like, no, that's too much. The spec was supposed to be very large, and then it sort of just collapsed and everything fell apart. People like Yahoo, Microsoft, Google, they were all involved, and it just kind of fell apart. So we kind of stuck with ES3 for a while, and then in about 2009, work got started on ES3.1, which actually eventually just became ES5, which is what we use and hopefully love today. It was later renamed to ES5 because it was just a subset of ES4, and they just completely skipped the whole 4. 2015, so after that, basically work began on ES6. So in 2015, actually in June, it was released. Work began in 2008 on ES6. They created something called ECMAScript Harmony, because there's a lot of contention in the ES4 parties, so they wanted to make it harmonious for everybody. So they later renamed it ES6. Or they later again renamed it ECMAScript 2015. Honestly, ES6 is probably what people will stick with for so long because they used it for so long. So don't worry about getting that proper all the time. And it was finalized. Yeah, so it was released. It was kind of like approved as of June. And that's it. We're good. We're done. We don't have to worry about it anymore, right? Not quite. Just because it's approved doesn't mean it's going to show up in all the browsers. So it's going to take a little bit of time. And basically, with this new naming, ECMAScript 2015, there's going to be a new release cycle. So it's going to be like a yearly release cycle. So next year, we'll get ECMAScript 2016. And it'll just kind of keep going like that. I think they're trying to focus on smaller upgrades to the language. But let's actually get into talking about some of the new features in ES6. So let is a new keyword we get. Before the let keyword in ES5, we had function scoping. So most other languages have an idea of block scoping, but JavaScript had function scoping. So what that means is that if you take a look at something like this, fairly common, right? And when I'm talking to students, and we talk about functions, and then we talk about like loops and stuff like that, for loops themselves kind of look like functions, and it can get confusing as to why that I has a value outside of this for loop, right? Because you think, oh, like it's sort of like inside of this function-looking thing. It shouldn't exist outside of there. However, because we have function scoping in ES5 now, I is available outside, and it gets a little confusing. Enter let. Now we have this new let keyword, which I think kind of effectively replaces var in a lot of senses. There's almost no use case to use var anymore. Let will actually block scope itself. So if we say var or for let I equals 0 and do all that stuff, the I variable has no value outside of there. It's scoped specifically just to that block. And I think this can actually help students just kind of understand things better. So that's why I consider it to be an easy win. The great thing about this is that we have the let keyword. We also have the const keyword coming up. But when I say blocks, I mean basically anything between two curly brackets. You could actually just know if you didn't even have like an if statement, an else statement, anything like that, just put two curly brackets. You could create a block and create your kind of instances of variables and just say, after that, you're done with them. So again, if you did something like this, if true var name equals Ryan, again, you would maybe assume Ryan, or a name outside of that would be undefined. Nope, it's not how that works. But if you say let name equal Ryan, because it's inside of this block, we're good to go. Jumped the gun on const before, but here's const. In other programming languages, we have this idea of constant variables. In JavaScript, we used to be able to we just had a convention where if we used all uppercase characters, we were sort of signaling to other developers and to ourselves, hey, this value is going to be constant. Don't do anything with it. Please don't change it. This is like an API key or something like that. However, sad state of affairs is you could change it, you could alter it, and you probably would have some terrible days after that happens. With ES6, we get this new const keyword. So the way const works is pretty much the exact same as the let keyword. It's block scoping, all those great things. But once you assign a value to it, the value stored in the variable can no longer be altered. So it becomes a read-only variable. You could use that value and apply it somewhere else. That's totally cool. But if you tried to do something like this, where you say const API key equals, and then some long key, and then maybe many, many lines, hundreds of lines later, you're like, oh, did I put that API key there? Maybe you weren't paying attention. You're like, oh, I'm just going to use this again. You would just get a silent error, and it would just kind of keep on going. Nothing would happen, but the value would be the original value. And this is great. Again, thinking about students, this is something that kind of happens quite a bit, where when you're starting to learn the program, you kind of create variables just out of nowhere all the time. You're like, oh, I definitely need something for that, when maybe you didn't remember you had it before. So something like this would kind of stop them and halt them and be like, wait a second, why isn't this the value I want it to be? And kind of get them into the process of thinking about what's going on. Cool? So those two are great. I think those are probably the easiest of wins. In terms of using those, don't just go to all of your programs now and turn every var into a let and a const and stuff like that, because inside of your programs, you might not have known it, but maybe you were using that var, how it works, kind of function scope-wise, to its advantage. And if you did that, you might actually have some breaking changes. So kind of rule of thumb is if you're going to do that, kind of take it on programs you're starting now or new stuff you're writing, and start using that stuff today. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I have a whole chart, and we'll talk about how to use it today. I think let and const are supported in native or current Chrome, current Firefox, probably Safari now that it's the new Safari, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Template strings is the next one. How many people really enjoy concatenating strings? No? How many people don't enjoy concatenating strings? Yeah. So inside of ES6, we have this new syntax. So concatenating is a real pain. Again, it's one of those things that when you're learning programming, you're learning to kind of build up these interactive dynamic programs. You want to collect some user input. You want to show some output. And concatenating, this whole syntax of kind of coming outside of your variables and stuff like that, or your strings, very confusing, can get really messy if you have very long strings. So in ES6, we get a new template string syntax. And it looks something like this. So basically, there's two key features here. Instead of quotes, so double or single, we have this new backtick character. That's the character just under your escape key by the tilde, the wiggly one. And we don't have to concatenate anymore. We use this new $ curly brackets expression, and we put our variables inside of there. And when the JavaScript engine, so something like V8, kind of runs through this, it just replaces it with the variable value. Way, way, way simpler. So easy. We no longer have crazy, messy adds and kind of going in and out of quotes that I use single quotes or double quotes, that kind of stuff. The great thing about template strings is that they're also now multi-line. So before, if you wanted to have multi-line strings in JavaScript, lots of ways you could get around it, but you probably just have var string equals the start, semicolon, then you'd maybe put the new line character in there, and then on another line kind of like can keep concatenating towards that. But inside of ES6, with this backtick string literal, we can just go ahead and put a return on that, and it'll actually acknowledge that return and put it on the page for you. It's pretty sweet. So again, consider something like this, like really simple. If you made like an API call, AJAX call, you got some data back, you just want to throw some data onto the page, you could do something like this. But using the new syntax, we could do something like this. A lot easier to understand. And this kind of takes us away from having to use things like maybe handlebars if we just wanted to do something simple like this. There already are solutions out there for templating, but now that we have sort of a native way to template, it makes things a little bit easier for us. Cool. Arrow functions. So this is probably one of my favorite features of ES6. How many people have heard of arrow functions before? Arrow functions are pretty sweet. I don't know why people seem to hate writing the word function. I still like writing it, but I really like this syntax for functions. So in ES6, we have this new syntax, the arrow function, and this is actually taken from CoffeeScript, I believe. I believe they actually looked at the arrow functions, the fat arrow functions of CoffeeScript. I don't write CoffeeScript that much, so I'm not sure the appropriate name for it. I think it's fat arrow function. Can somebody confirm? Did I? Fat arrow function? Yeah. And they created this. So we only have one arrow, because I think in CoffeeScript you get two different arrows. But you would do something like this. So let add equal, and then we have parentheses, a, b, this fat arrow, and then what looks to be a function body. The syntax effectively removes the function keyword and gives us this arrow. And we can put our parameters there and do the same things. That's cool. Not a big change. What's the big deal? Maybe you want to do something like this. If you have a single line statement, get rid of those curly brackets altogether. We don't need them. In fact, if you have a single line statement that simply is just going to be a return, remove that return keyword altogether. So you start to get this really nice simple syntax, one line, and we're just adding two things together. It's really quite great. So when we have a single line statement in the body of our arrow functions, there's an implicit return there. We don't have to explicitly say, hey, return this. If you did have some other expressions and statements you wanted to run before the return, you would have to put the return keyword there. This will only work for a single line statement. But this is really, really nice. The one problem, or not so much of a problem, with arrow functions is how we bind this. How many people feel like they have a really good grasp of this in JavaScript? How many people feel like they're not too sure how to bind this in JavaScript? Sweet. How many people are just not sure what this is? OK. So the this keyword inside of JavaScript can be a little confusing, especially when it comes to learning it. Because if you just write it in the browser, it's like the window, but then it's inside of an object, so then it's like the object. If it's inside of a function, like who knows what it is, stuff like that. So consider this, for example, a very simple object. We just have a sayname method, and it just wants to console out, hi, I am Ryan. Using a function like this without the function without an arrow function, and we use an anonymous function, this keyword will be bound to our object. So it'll be bound to our person object. So we'll be able to say, effectively what the console.log says is person.name, we retrieve name. However, it gets a little confusing. So this is why you don't want to just like straight up use arrow functions. If you do something like this, where we change the sayname method to, instead of being an anonymous function, and to be an arrow function, the scope for this keyword actually changes. The arrow functions are what we call lexically scoped. I like to just think of parent scope in this case. So this inside of our arrow function is actually sort of referring to, in this case, we'll assume it's the window. So not this object, but the last this context. So that can get a little confusing. So we have this lexical scoping when we use arrow functions. And in a case like that, probably not the best use case. However, Where it would be really nice is a situation like this. Again, really simple example. But again, we have this person object. We have a name. We have an array of hobbies. And then maybe we have a method that simply just loops through all the hobbies and prints them out. Ryan likes such and such, right? Problem. Using an anonymous function here, this .hobbies is what we want because that's our current object. However, for each, the function inside of the for each function, the this keyword changes. You would assume, and as a student, you would assume, oh, it's still going to be that person object. This is going to work just perfectly. However, what we'll get is undefined likes robots. Not so sweet. But if we use arrow function, we can kind of get around this. There have been kinds of ways to do this in the past. So this is not an uncommon, or something like this is not uncommon, where we have, you would just save a reference to this in a variable called like self, and then you would say this .hobbies for each, keep that anonymous function as the callback function, and just say like self.name, etc. Sometimes you see like underscore this or that, or whatever you want to call it, basically a reference to the actual object. However, because arrow functions, the scope of this keyword is mapped sort of to the parent, we could just use an arrow function inside of that for each method, and we get what we want, because this binding doesn't change. It stays with the person object. So that's really nice. And I'm going to throw it out there. In ES6, with object literals, we can actually remove on the show hobbies method, function up there. Let's remove it all together. You can actually have this shortened method syntax, that's a hard one to say, on object literals inside of ES6. And I think we're going to see this a lot, especially where I'm going to talk about React in terms of ES6. And people start using this a lot when they're doing like React render and stuff like that because, I don't know, they hate the function keyword for some reason. I still like it. So this would be just a slightly altered example, but we're using shortened method names, arrow functions, and string templating. Starting to look pretty nice, I think. Boop. One place this is going to look really nice is when we get into functional programming. Functional programming is all about little functions we can reuse to sort of transform our data the way we want. So if we had something like this, again, very simple, an array of numbers, and we wanted to create maybe double those numbers, we could say nums.map. Map just runs a function over each item in the array and returns a new array. And we could say num, and then return num times 2. What do you notice about this one, though? What did I miss? What did I leave out there? The parentheses, right. If you have a single argument in your, or a parameter in your function, get those parentheses out there. So you get this really nice single line statement that just says num, transform it to be number times 2. Really, really nice. I think this will come up a lot more and more, especially as we start to move into using ES6 a lot. So, cool. Spread operators. So the spread operator is a pretty cool one. Well, I'll just show you. So how many times have you seen a line of code that looks like this? Math.max.apply, null, and then an array of numbers or something like that. How many people really understand what's going on here? People don't understand what's going on here. Effectively, what apply is doing is it's taking this array here, because math.max accepts just a set of arguments. It doesn't accept the array like that. But so many times we're like, oh, I need to take this array of numbers and find the maximum number on it. So what apply will do is it'll take all those numbers and apply them to the array, kind of just saying like 45, 32, et cetera, et cetera. A little confusing. Again, when you're thinking about students, not the nicest kind of syntax. With the spread operator, we get this new syntax of this ... array of numbers. And it effectively just spreads our array out across the function call. So if you just took out the square brackets on that array and just moved it in, it'd just be like calling math.max 45, 32, 1, 3, 5. So we just get to spread them out. We don't have to use this apply anymore. Now, apply will still have its place because apply is used for other reasons as well, like changing the context of a function call and stuff like that. But if you just need to do something like this, it's going to be really nice and easy. Again, the syntax is kind of like this, and it effectively equates to this. So we have numbers, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if I console.log ... so the ... is the spread parameter syntax, it'll just console them out instead of in an array, just as the spreaded out numbers. I think this is much easier to understand, especially when you're showing students this kind of stuff.
Is there spread in ES5? 2 dots?
No.
Or did it just React?
Probably just React. Yeah, I don't know what the 2 dots would be. The opposite of spread parameters, or spread operators, is rest parameters. Rest parameters basically lets us gather all of the arguments that get called on our functions. Again, we've had a solution sort of for this in ES5 before. We've had the arguments keyword. How many people have used the arguments keyword before? Yeah, so we have this arguments keyword that you don't have to, when you do a callback function, you don't have to state all of the order in which variables come back. You can just call arguments, and it has like a list of them. It's an array-like object, which I'll get to in a second. Rest parameters look something like this. ... arguments, and that's it. So arguments is the name that we're going to use inside of our function. So it could be ... numbers or something like that, if you know that's kind of what's going into it. And what happens is something like this. So numbers, again, is our array. We create a new function up here called add, which we use the rest parameters to say, somebody's going to pass in some unknown number of parameters into this. And I want to return, again, using our arrow function, just a reduced version, just sum them up, basically, right? So you have let sum equal add, and then you pass in numbers. And what it does is it'll take each of those numbers, spread it out, and it will allow us to use all these array methods on it. If you've ever used arguments before, the arguments keyword, you know that it's an array-like object. It doesn't have all of these methods like reduce and map and filter and stuff like that. You would have to use, going back to the other example of spread operators, you'd have to use like .apply and .call. Now we don't have to. Now we get like sort of a better native way of doing this. The value returned in ... numbers is an actual array. It's pretty sweet. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, we've had the arguments keyword before, but now we have a nicer way to do it. And it's an actual array, so we can call these actual array methods on it. So we get map, filter, reduce, all of these nice things. Modules. So again, in JavaScript, JavaScript developers are pretty smart. They always come up with new libraries, things to kind of polyfill features that don't exist. So we've had modules before in some sense. We've had like AMD and CommonJS and stuff like that. We've never had a native implementation. In ES6, we get a native implementation of modules. How many people have used Node before? How many people use like the require statement or module.exports? So that's how in Node, you can kind of have modules. I think that follows the CommonJS spec, if I remember correctly. In ES6, we get this new nice one. I actually really like this one because you say something like this. So we have an import and an export. So we're able to import things, like actually retrieve information from modules. And inside of our modules, which I'll show you in a second, we can export information. Again, React is becoming, I don't know, have you heard about React before? I heard it's pretty popular. React is kind of leading the way in this. A lot of people's code tutorials, snippets, you always see like import React from React if they're using Babel, which I'll show you a little bit later. And basically what it's saying is React on the far right is a module that we want to import, and this uppercase React is the thing that we want to import it. So it's basically the object, the whole object React. So we can import something from something. And if we're able to import, we're able to export. So when we're writing our own modules, we can export our own functions or values, objects, arrays, stuff like that. So the syntax is like this. So you can have a single export, like a default export from your module, or you can actually have multiple named exports. This would be the example syntax for a single export from a module. You would say export default, and then whatever you want to do, a function, an array, an object, something like that. And then down here, if this was in a different file, you could say import name, so you could name it anything you want from your module.js or something like that. Really quite nice. And again, yeah.
Is that a path statement, module.js?
Sorry?
Is that effectively a path statement?
Yes, yeah. Module, the thing in quotes here, module, that'd be a path. So if you had, your module in a different folder, you'd have to go into the folder like js/module/ and then the name of the module. Yeah, great question. So that was an example of doing a single export. If you want to do multiple exports, you could do something like this. There's maybe a module.js file, export function add, export function multi, and then in your script.js, where you're sort of pulling these modules in, you could import only the add one if you wanted to just use it there. And maybe somewhere else you would use multiply or something like that. It gives us this great ability, again, natively. We've had these features. We've had like require.js. We even have like browserify to do this stuff. But now we can do it natively.
How do you import when you have multiple?
Sorry?
How do you import it all when you have multiple defined?
Oh, well, I can actually show you in a second when we talk about destructuring.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's using braces
On add.
It's import brace add brace.
Import add from.
Like that's the default import, like the global default import. There's two exports you can do import brace name.
Oh, you mean like, wait for it? That? Yeah. We're going to talk about that in destructuring. Yeah.
So I understand that example.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was going to talk about that in destructuring. So, great question. The question was, if we have these multiple exports, how do we kind of pull them all in? We get this thing called destructuring inside of ES6. So, say you have, very simple example, something like this. Again, maybe we've made an AJAX call. We have this huge object. We only want to pull out like a few values. You could do something like this, where we have person equals name, age, and location. And we can say let, and then you get this curly bracket name, comma, age equals person. This is actually a little interesting because what we're doing is effectively defining new name and age variables outside of this person object, but we're pulling them from person. So on the the right-hand side is the object we want to pull the values from, and on the left-hand side is these new variables that we want to create the names for. Again, this is becoming pretty popular if you start talking about React, and you start talking about stuff like React Router, for example. This is just pulled from the installation kind of docs for React, but if you're using ES6, you could use an import and import sort of the ones that you want from it, and then React-Router is the module that exports all these different things. If you didn't do this in ES6, or you're just doing this like with browserify or something like that, you'd have to do require React Router, .router, require React Router .route, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you start to get these nice sort of like single line statements that are fairly easy to read, and they don't just clutter up our code anymore. We also get a class keyword. How many people come from a language that actually has like a class in it? How many people came to JavaScript and they're like, where's the class? It's still classy though, right? Anyways. Before classes in ES6, we could emulate them. We could use prototypes and kind of create our own class structures. So, I mean, really basic example, you have like a warrior like this. We use the this keyword, and we bind some properties and methods. And whenever we use the new keyword, when we instantiate the warrior, we kind of get this new object returned. This gets a bit messy when we start thinking about how do we take that warrior and like start to use it to inherit on other things. So maybe you have a fighter, which is like a different kind of warrior, and it has specific weapons, but I want all those other things the warrior has. You could do something like this, where you just find like a new fighter constructor, fighter.prototype equals this warrior, and then my fighter is this other thing. Again, it can start to kind of like grow and kind of become not so nice. Enter class. So with the class keyword, we get this new syntax that looks probably a little bit more familiar for people coming from a language with classes. The class starts with a new keyword class, so instead of like function, whatever. It'd be class, the name, and then a block. Every class has a constructor. The constructor is called when you instantiate it. and then you just apply your methods from there. One thing to note about the syntax for classes is when you have multiple methods, you no longer have to put the commas to sort of separate them, which is kind of trips you up a little bit at first, but it actually looks pretty nice, so I like that quite a bit. And then you would instantiate it as normal. If you wanted to use that warrior to sort of inherit from if you wanted to create a new object that inherits from warrior, you could do this. We create a class fighter that simply just extends. The naming, the language here is actually a lot nicer. Simply extends from warrior. And then in our constructor, we get this super call, which just imports all the things from the warrior, and then we apply our things from there.
The super is required.
Yeah, in this case, yeah. Again, this is new, and actually under the hood, it's actually just syntactic sugar for the prototype pattern, because that kind of works for them already. So you can just add a little bit of flavoring on top of it to kind of make it work the way you want. And again, React's pretty cool. So you're seeing this a lot in React lately. You're seeing stuff like this, where maybe you have a new component you're creating. So you say class item. That's going to be the name of our component. Extends. And instead of doing like react.createClass, you would extend it from React's component. You don't have to do a constructor or anything like that. You could just simply have your render method. Again, shortened method names here that would just return your JSX stuff. How many people, probably like 2 or 3 weeks ago, no, maybe a little bit longer than that, were reading all that stuff where like, classes are so bad in JavaScript? No? 1 person? 2 people maybe? Anyways, classes with React. People are getting a little up in arms about people using classes to just like extend everything and kind of getting this really weird, muddled interface. General rule of thumb when you're doing React and you're using classes, don't create React components that are then going to extend other components. Simply just create your components and only extend from React component. It's just like that. What it really gives us is a nice way to write these components. And we can just like export those classes using our modules, and things just start to get really, really nice. Cool. One of the last things we're going to talk about is promises. Again, JavaScript developers, pretty smart people. We've already had promises, implementations of promises before. Now we finally have in JavaScript a native implementation of promises. The syntax and sort of the structure around this is a little bit different than some of the libraries, like if you use like a queue or something like that. So let's just kind of take a quick walkthrough. So it works like this. You would store on a variable a new promise. That promise constructor takes a callback function. Again, we can use our arrow function here. Really nice. That arrow function or that callback function gets 2 values passed to it. The first is a callback for our resolve state. So when we, inside of our promise, resolve something, we would call that and pass some data along. The second is the reject state. So if something bad happened, we would call that and pass some information along. And it would look something like this. You would say let prom equal a new constructor of promise. Resolve and reject is our callback. Sorry, it had to go down to the other line to get it up there. And then you would say, do some stuff in here. If something was true, resolve and pass your message or data along. If there was something that was bad, so if there's an error or whatever, you could reject it and pass your information along. And in order to see what happens, to see if your promise is resolved or rejected, all promises, so the value stored in our prom object, have a then method. The then method takes a callback, or sorry, it takes 2 callbacks. The first callback is for when something is successful, so a resolve. And the second callback is for when something has been rejected, or there was like an error. This is something, yeah? What about finally? So there are other methods on the promise, like all and stuff like that. I've only looked at all because that's the only time I've had to use it. But I believe there's a finally or something along those lines. Yeah, I promise I'll look that up later, though. So if we go back to this one, we have our promise, and we can see if there's a resolve or a reject. And then if we look at this one here, we can actually use this for multiple promises. So again, promises are usually used when we have some sort of asynchronous coding, so mostly AJAX or animations or something along those lines, probably the earliest things you'd use promises for. So sometimes you need to wait until 2, 3, 4, 5 promises kind of resolve themselves. So we can use something like this, where we create our promises up here. Inside of those promise function bodies, we would have our code that is going to be the asynchronous stuff, maybe an animation, maybe some AJAX call. And then we can use the constructor and the all method to say, when these two are resolved, bring them back and give me the data. And then you could spit it out on the page. However, inside of this all method, the then, or all returns another promise that you have the .then on. And this then method, again, accepts 2 arguments, a resolve function and a reject function. So if any of the promises that get passed to all reject, even one of them, if you had 100 of them and one of them got rejected, all would just reject itself completely. It's a fail fast, I believe, is what they refer to it as. So you'd want to make sure you do some error handling there as well. Sorry?
So this is parallel, the equivalent of async parallel.
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
The old executed parallel that you join.
Yeah. So using ES6 today, so we've talked about all this stuff. This is great. How can we use it today? Well, how many people are using Node already? How many people are on Node 4 something, the Argon release? Basically, as of Node 4, a lot of ES6 features were implemented. So you can just use them without having to do any sort of transforming of your JavaScript. You can just use them today, which is great. If you're not using Node yet and you're thinking about getting into Node, great place to start using ES6 now. You don't have to worry about any big configurations to kind of compile your JavaScript down to get it working. And so if you want to do that in Toronto, there's Node School Toronto. You can always come there and just kind of get some help and play around. However, if we're working in the browser, not quite the same. Again, we're going to have multiple different browsers. We've got Internet Explorer, Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Opera, all these things. Not everybody is going to have the same support because it was just sort of finalized in June. It's going to be a while before everybody has all these features in it. So we're going to want to use something like Babel or Babel. Babel, hands up, if that's how you pronounce it. Babel, hands up? All right. Yeah, I always get it wrong. Even though I've seen the guy say it, I'm just like, nope, I already forgot what it was. I'm going to show you a really quick script for Babel. But if you want to know the current support of ES6 today, there's a really good resource, the Cangax compatibility chart. I'll show you that after I get out of the presentation at the end here. But it shows you all the features, where they're available, and sort of how they relate to other browsers. So Babel, I already screwed it up. There's a lot of ways we could use this. You could do it just straight from your command line using just the CLI for it. Or we could use something like gulp. How many people are using gulp? Or grunts? Broccoli? Brunch? There you go. I had brunch this morning. It was pretty good. We would use something like gulp. So it's very common to use something like gulp to transpile our JavaScript. So the idea of taking ES6, so JavaScript is sort of like the next version of JavaScript, and using it today is we have to transpile it. We have to actually take it from ES6 and convert it to an ES5, so current browser-ready JavaScript, so that the browser can understand it. But we get to write in ES6, so our authoring experience is nicer, and it just kind of compiles down. And we don't even want to worry what it looks like when it compiles down. We just worry about our ES6 code. So really quick example of how to do this would be something like this in gulp. You set up your gulp tasks, so you require a couple modules. Gulp Babel, gulp concat, sorry? Babar? Yeah, I'll go with Babar. Gulp babar. We set up our gulp task for our JavaScript. And because gulp is a file that runs through Node, we can just write our ES6 code in there. Boom, perfect. We got our arrow functions, our let keywords, stuff like that. You just basically say, take anything, and I'm just using an arbitrary, anything with an extension of .esnext.js as our code. Run it through Babel, so pipe it through babar, pipe it through concat, and then just finally output it. And it's really just that simple. So in order to get started writing your own stuff today, you could just use a simple script like this. If you just Google gulp and babar or Babel online, you'll probably find a million different versions of how you could do this.
Is there a cost to this? Will the transpile code be longer? And
Yeah, it gets. I'm going to show you a little example. It gets a little like funky, but ultimately, I don't know if there's real performance cost, to be honest, because yeah, it is a little bit bigger, but it's probably not significantly. Unless you have like a very significant application, then you probably have other ways of getting around the performance cost there. A couple other resources if you want to start learning today. 2 EPUB books that are actually really great. Understanding ES6 by, oh shoot. One of these is Axel Roschmeyer, and the other one is Nicholas Zakis. I forget which one. I should have put their names on there. They're both great books. They're actually free to read online, as all the LeanPub ones are, or you can just purchase them. There's actually even a bundle you could buy them in. And the website for Babel actually has a great Learn ES 2015 section that actually kind of go through all this stuff and kind of get you up to date as well. Yeah, thanks.